WABE in Atlanta. This is Savory Stories, a show where we take a look at Atlanta's people through its cuisine and food history.
On this podcast, we trace Atlanta's food story from the past to the present, getting to know Atlanta's culinary creators and demystifying stereotypes about food.
I'm Akilah McConnell, culinary historian and owner of Unexpected Atlanta Tours, the #1 rated Atlanta tour and activity on TripAdvisor.
And I'm Chef Asita Reed, owner of Life Chef, where we help you live the life you love, and author of How to Feed a Kid, A Parent's Guide. Today, we're talking about the iconic Southern food, the buttermilk biscuit.
Oh, my favorite. Southern biscuits have long been the marker of a great cook. So let's dial it back and talk about Atlanta's history with the biscuit and where to find the best biscuits today. But before we do that, Asita, let's talk some personal history, because
Yes.
I know you got some stories about some biscuits, right?
Well, two immediately come to mind. The first was learning to make them with my grandlady. She was in town visiting, and my mom fell ill, so she took to the bed, and my grandlady took me to the kitchen and taught me how to make biscuits. Now, I was so young, I barely recall the end product, but I do remember playing with the dough. And as you know, Akilah, a huge no-no in biscuit making is overworking the dough. So that tells me she had given me my own dough to work with because I was doing the most. I'm not even gonna lie. To the point, I snuck into my mom's bedroom where she was sleeping and threw a biscuit ball at the mirror above her dresser. And there it stuck for time untold until one day, who knows how much later, my mom noticed it and pulled it off the mirror, and it left a permanent biscuit ball stain.
That is hilarious. I love that story. Biscuit memories for life. But you know, it's the wonderful thing about biscuit making is you can do it with kids.
Yes.
Kids love making biscuits and getting their hands in the dough.
And I think for anything dough-related and kid-related, just give them their own.
Yes,
Let them
yes.
do what they're going to do. That way your biscuits still come out perfect, but they get all that tactile memory and involvement in being a part of it.
My kids love to make mini biscuits.
Aw.
That's their favorite thing, is that like they make these like tiny, teeny biscuits when I make biscuits, and then they make their biscuits for their dolls, which is very
Aw,
cute.
That is super cute. I think my second biscuit memory comes from my stepdad. He was a Mrs. Winters man, and he introduced their chicken and biscuits to my mom, who was a church's chicken woman. And those biscuits blew my mind. They were lightly crisp on the edges, shining with a buttery base on top, and when you split them open, biscuity steam would just waft up and out like a commercial. Those biscuits were heaven compared to the horrible, dry, flavorless rolls churches used to carry. Mrs. Winters aren't as prevalent as they used to be in Atlanta, but if you find one, it's worth the stop, if only for the biscuits.
You know, Asita, that reminds me, one of my first biscuit memories was actually associated with fast food chain as well, and that was Hardee's biscuits.
Oh, yeah,
do you remember
I
that?
do.
They used to make these amazing cinnamon roll biscuits, and my friends and I, we used to sneak out of high school, drive over to the Hardee's, grab some Hardee's cinnamon biscuits, and come back. But you know, there's just so much biscuit lore that we could tell. So let's dial it back and get into the history. What do you think?
Yeah, well, Southern cooking and soul food are heavily dependent on biscuits as one of the main bread options, cornbread or biscuits. So how did biscuits come to be such an anchor for these cuisines?
Well, first off, in the antebellum time period, or the time period before the Civil War, wheat flour was a delicacy because wheat doesn't grow all that well here in the South.
Oh.
If you're driving through the South, even today, what you're going to be seeing is a lot of cornfields, not wheat fields. So for everyday use, people ate cornmeal and corn flour. Wheat had to be brought in on trains, and generally only the wealthiest in the city would be able to afford wheat flour. So biscuits in this antebellum time period was a food reserved for the wealthy.
I did not know that, and I wonder if that kind of contributes to the specialness of biscuits.
Absolutely. Even today, we're still feeling the impact of that. And it's why so many of us think of biscuits as this iconic celebratory food. It's what makes the meal, right? Now, another major difference is that the biscuits eaten in the 1800s were very different than the biscuits we eat today. In the mid to late 1800s, biscuits tended to use yeast, which much more resembled our dinner rolls. Actually, one of the most popular forms of biscuits was something called the beaten biscuit. The beaten biscuit, it was a great biscuit to get out your aggression, because the way that you would get your biscuit to rise would be literally abusing the dough with a hammer for 15 minutes to an hour until the dough blistered.
That's intense.
The blistered dough would then rise just a little bit, but not all that much. And so when it cooked in the oven, the beaten biscuit would end up resembling something more similar to what we would consider a cracker today. It would last for a very long time and could be carried while traveling. And I'm just going to be super honest with you. I've tried these beaten biscuits today. They are very, very dry. Not at all like the sweet, fluffy biscuits we think of today. If you go to the Kentucky Derby, you can still taste beaten biscuits. And the way they serve them is with country ham. So in the way that you might think of, ham and crackers or something like that, they were more the vessel for the meat rather than being the star in the show. But as you can imagine, if it used to take 15 minutes to an hour to just beat that dough, it took a really long time. And these biscuits used to be known as a Sunday food because it was just too time consuming and expensive to make every single day.
And that might be another thing contributing to the lore of biscuits being, again, a special food. Why were people eating these dry-hard biscuits? I mean, biscuits should be light and fluffy. That doesn't sound good at all. And nothing like the pillowy goodness I know and love.
Well, that's because at the time, early 1800s, there was no commercially available leavener.
Oh.
So pre-Civil War, bakers used to get yeast from the leavings of brewer's yeast. So that's like basically you get beer and then there would be this leftover yeast from beer making. And that's what they used to use to bake bread. Or the alternative is that they would make sourdough. There was a leavening agent that was created by the Native Americans that was called pearlash. That was used prior to the Civil War, but that took a lot of time to make. So just not a lot of ways to really get your breads to rise. By the early 1800s, baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate, that had been invented. And then cream of tartar, that was actually a byproduct of winemaking. What used to happen is that pharmacists or chemists would sell baking soda and cream of tartar. And then cooks used to combine these together. But if you've ever used baking soda and cream of tartar to bake any sort of bread product, it's very unpredictable. It does not result in consistently even leavened bread. So it was just very difficult to be a great baker in the 1800s because you couldn't be assured of the consistency of your biscuits. You wouldn't know if your leavening would leave your dough sour or flat.
That really gives me an appreciation of some of the bakers you've mentioned in some of our earlier stories on City Lights. You know, from the 1800s and, being lauded in the newspaper as being an amazing cake maker under these conditions. That's impressive.
Absolutely. I've talked about Myra Miller in the past, who was known as one of the top bakers in Atlanta. First off, she was cooking over an open fire with baking soda and cream of tartar. That's crazy.
It's
amazing to think about.
Well, I've just been taking fluffy biscuits for granted. I assumed they were always a thing. We Southerners sneer at scones, right? Thinking our soft, fluffy biscuits are superior, but really, their origins were dry and hard as well.
It's actually associated with why British people call their cookies biscuits, and we call our biscuits biscuits. So when you think about it, they both kind of have this similar origin of this dry, hard substance, no real leavening. But then this life-changing invention takes place, and that was the invention of baking powder. Now, what is baking powder? First off, baking powder is a combination of sodium bicarbonate, an acid like cream of tartar, and cornstarch. So all three of these ingredients existed separately prior to the Civil War. But in 1843, an English chemist named Alfred Bird wanted to make a yeast-free leavener because his wife was actually allergic to yeast. So he was being a super good husband.
Right.
So he created this mixture, which he called baking soda. It became a huge bestseller because it resulted in very consistently leavened product. Here in the United States in 1859, even Horsford and George Wilson created Rumford baking powder, which began to be sold in the years after the Civil War. And yes, that continues to be my baking powder choice today. I still use Rumford baking powder.
A Rumford baking powder can is a whole aesthetic unto itself, clearly a sign of good taste and quality.
So one thing that's really funny is that after the Civil War, a lot of people didn't know how to use baking powders, and there were also poor quality baking powders that would come out. Many of these were infused with aluminum, which turned their baked goods super bitter.
Yeah.
And it's the reason why I prefer Rumford, and I highly recommend that you always look at your baking powder can and make sure that you are purchasing aluminum-free baking powder, because even today, some companies still use aluminum in their baking powder, and it makes your baked goods taste terrible. It just doesn't taste good.
You got to get the good stuff.
So back in the day, many of the cooks preferred to utilize what they knew and just stick with yeast. But baking powder advertisers were insistent, continuously pulling out recipe books that used their product and advertising that baking powder could produce the best soft, flaky, tall biscuits.
That tactic has worked for so many foods and products. If you want folks to use it, you have to give them tantalizing recipes that are familiar yet edgy. So basically, we have fluffy biscuits because of good marketing.
That, as well as some really cool inventors, and really amazing inventors. And one of these huge advertisers was a newly created company out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and that was called White Lily. Created by owner J. Allen Smith, it was named after his wife, Lily, Lillie. So White Lily is a low-protein, low-gluten flour. It contains only 9% protein and uses a soft red winter wheat. Now, that's a type of wheat that is grown in the past, only grown in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. So yes, the southern states, these are the states where we make biscuits. So I just want you to compare 9% protein level to a King Arthur's 11.7 protein percent or Gold Medal's 10.5% protein. Asada, why does this matter? Why does the protein levels matter?
That protein content makes a big difference when baking because it corresponds directly with how much gluten forms when the flour and liquid meet. So, for example, if you want a really strong loaf with chewiness, you want a high protein flour, like a bread flour. King Arthur's bread flour, which is my preferred brand, has a 12.7% protein content, meaning that you will get more gluten and result in a crustier, chewier bread. White Lily's flour has a very low protein content and is also bleached with chlorine, weakening the flour's proteins even further, meaning that when you bake with it, you get a very soft, light biscuit. And that's why people say you can only get good biscuits in the South. Folks here swear by White Lily, even calling it the biscuit flour.
I mean, frankly, it's been the best-selling flour in Atlanta for over 90 years. And in the early 1900s, 70% of the flour sold in Atlanta was White Lily's self-rising flour.
Wow.
Self-rising flour, by the way, self-rises because it already pre-contains baking powder and salt, making it just ready to go. So, going back to biscuits being this special food, for a long time, White Lily self-rising flour was actually known as the Sunday flour because you would use it to make your biscuits for Sunday dinner. We're just so lucky, I think, to be able to find White Lily flour here easily in Atlanta. It's a staple in my pantry because it truly makes the best biscuits and pie crusts.
Yes, biscuits and pie crust. Two things you definitely want to be tender and flaky. And I'm glad we brought up these differences in flours for our listeners. If you happen to have all-purpose or AP flour, you'll need to add a bit of baking powder and salt to it. to make those lofty, tender biscuits. And again, a low-protein flour is for biscuits because you want less structure in the dough so that the biscuits will rise and be light. Higher proteins are great for breads because when you want them to have more structure, that protein will hold up and you'll have something nice and weighty for your sandwiches.
When we come back, we're going to talk about our recommendations for biscuits in the city today.
By the 1920s, the tall, flaky buttermilk biscuit that we know and love had become an integral part of Southern cooking. Now, I mentioned earlier that overworking your dough will make your biscuits tough, but we can't forget the importance of temperature. For the best biscuits, you want cold. Cold what? Cold everything. That way, when your biscuits go into a hot oven, the heat-activated baking powder starts the rising process, and the butter melts away, leaving pockets of air that get trapped in the stretching dough. That right there is fluff. But we don't want you thinking that biscuit making is only for the experts.
Absolutely. And it's why my company, Unexpected Atlanta Tours, we have a whole food tour and class all about biscuits. It's called our Historic Market and Biscuit Class, and you can find it at unexpectedatlanta.com. You'll learn the history of bread, taste from 5 amazing vendors at the Municipal Market in Atlanta, as well as learn how to make biscuits using my tried, true, and tested recipe. Guests constantly are surprised by how fast and easy it is to make great Southern biscuits. And once you learn how to make them, frankly, you'll find yourself making them every single week because they are just that good. But if we can't make them at home, where do we go, Asada?
Well, let's hit these ATL streets and make our first stop over at the Real Milk and Honey in East Point. Biscuits here get an appetizer treatment, arriving before your main course on their own platter and smothered in a biscuit honey glaze. The biscuits are huge, dense, and buttery on multiple levels. There's butter in the biscuit, butter on the biscuit, butter in the glaze. It's a knife and fork table appetizer, but I see people ordering them to go to take home. And can you blame them?
Anything that has butter, no. And with biscuits, that's the secret ingredient is the butter. It's got to be butter, and more of that good butter. Let's talk about another one. Where else would you go to?
Bomb Biscuit has a cult following. They started up as a pop-up back in 2016, and their fans are so legion that they now stand alone. The biscuit sandwiches have sweet and savory options. That's what they're famous for, and that appeals to a wide variety of folks. I'm a savory girl when it comes to breakfast, believe it or not.
I like it.
Yeah, that's right up my alley. And they are leading with a complete Atlanta classic over there, and that is the lemon pepper chicken biscuit.
That makes total sense and essential. But you know, I gotta tell you, Asada, back in the day, speaking of lines out the door, there used to be a place that we would go to back when I was in college, and the lines would be out the door for the biscuits. You know where I'm talking about, right?
Out the door and down the street, and the wait time was just built into your experience, and that's the Flying Biscuit.
That's right. So tell us about the Flying Biscuit.
Well, let's give a shout out to this Atlanta OG, which has been serving breakfast, brunch, and lunch for 30 years. The Flying Biscuit Cafe opened in 1993 in Candler Park, and that's where we stood.
Yes,
on the sidewalk.
Yes, it is. In the sidewalk, and there was nothing exciting there. You just stood on the sidewalk.
Yeah, there really wasn't anything else there. Flying Biscuit kind of anchored that neighborhood as far as eateries go. And that's the first breakfast brunch line I've ever stood in. That's how popular it was. But standing in line, you could peer through the windows and just see speed racks full of trays of fluffy biscuits coming straight out of the oven. Sometimes they even ran out of biscuits during the brunch rush, which was heartbreaking. But now they're all grown up. Flying Biscuits have over 30 locations throughout the Southeast, each claiming to bake almost 5,000 biscuits a day.
And I will tell you, Asada, if you ever get the chance to take a road trip up to Asheville, North Carolina, I highly recommend checking out Early Girl Eatery, which is a restaurant founded by Chef April Moon, who is the original founder of Flying Biscuit. And oh my gosh, the biscuits up there are still so good. They're always coming out with great new ideas. It's a little bit of a ways from Atlanta,
but Asheville is beautiful, and I just imagine biscuits in Asheville would be amazing. Something about the elevation.
It is. So if you like your biscuits with a side of coffee, where do you go?
Java Jive. Java Jive is all things retro. Its decor is adorably vintage, and their breakfast is worth the wait on weekends. Their biscuits fill that description as well, vintage, because while a lot of places are going for these like huge stuffed or creative biscuits with great presentations and flavors, the biscuits at Java Jive look like your granny made them. And they've been making them this way since like 1945. They are the perfect size for a spread of jam or a smear of butter, and sensibly served alongside your breakfast standards like crisp bacon, scrambled eggs, or a nice omelet, again, like Granny would serve. These biscuits boast a delicate, crispy crust and flaky layers of tenderness inside, and will transport you back to your childhood or teleport you over to mine.
That sounds perfect. So listeners, tell us, where do you like to go to get the best biscuits in Atlanta? What do you like to eat with your biscuits? Are you a jam person? Some eggs, honey? What do you like, Asada?
Sweet or savory? Again, I'm going savory. So as long as it's in the savory category, pop it in a biscuit, and I can walk and talk and eat at the same time.
So my choice is Banner Butter's cinnamon cardamom butter with some good fluffy biscuits that I make right in my own kitchen.
There you go.
Thank you all for joining Savory Stories. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you do that kind of thing with your favorite podcasts.
We'll be back in a few weeks with a new episode. See you then.
Savory Stories is produced by Crystal Devone and Kevin Rinker, with additional production and editing from Scotty Crow. The series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzes. For more information, visit wabe.org/Savory Stories.
WABE.